Hey folks, this is chapter 37, Communities and Ecosystems. So why do we start out talking about the fact that there are many drugs that are derived from plants? The reason being that this chapter is really related to interactions among communities within an ecosystem. So for example, many common drugs, even like aspirin, are derived from things that we find in plants. Morphine is a chemical that comes from opium poppies. There's a common plant called foxglove that has chemical components that make drugs that are used to treat congestive heart failure. And then we also use common plant stimulants, including our, the jolt we get from our morning caffeine. Caffeine is found in coffee berries and tea leaves, and lots of folks use the nicotine that's found in tobacco leaves. So researchers are always trying to test these newly discovered compounds that may have some kind of pharmaceutical promise. But again, why are we talking about this? Why are we even mentioning that plants make these substances? It's because there's some kind of adaptation that the plant has undergone over time in order to be successful in a community. So we're going to be talking about how these different communities and different populations within a community interact with one another, and what kinds of interactions those are. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about, again, interactions among organisms and how those relationships determine the features of the community. We'll also talk about the dynamics of ecosystems. So we'll learn an understanding of the ecological relationships that can help us manage Earth's resources more wisely. Okay, so there are two main ideas that we're gonna go over for this chapter. The first being community structure and dynamics. So these are the factors that influence the species composition of communities and the factors that affect how stable those communities are. And then in ecosystem structure and dynamics, that focuses mostly on how energy flows into and out of an ecosystem and how chemicals are cycled within that environment. Okay, so we've defined this in the past, but what do we mean by a biological community? So what we're talking about here is all of the populations of organisms that live in close enough proximity to one another for there to be potential interaction among organisms. So community ecologists are interested in studying these interactions and how these interactions influence the community as a whole, and how the factors affect the dynamics within that community. So I've been using the word interactions a lot, and that's really what we're talking about here. So how do different species interact with one another? So here we're talking about inter, meaning between specific species. So in between species, how different species interact with one another. So these interactions among species are fundamental to how a community is structured. And this table kind of sums up the different types of interactions that occur in a community, and how these different types of interactions what kinds of effects they have on a species. So either a negative effect, or it's harmful, or a positive effect, which is a positive. It's a positive effect on that organism. So this interspecific competition occurs. This first one here is competition, and again we're talking about interspecific, so between two species. So here we have the effects on how this type of interaction affects the first species and how it affects the second species. So interspecific competition occurs when populations of two different species compete for the same limited resource. So in this case, we have squirrels and black bears, and assuming that they, for example, feed on the same types of berries, they're competing with one another for that resource. So in this example, in the example of competition, it has a negative effect on both the species because the abundance of the resource that they're competing for is limited for both organisms. In mutualism, both populations benefit. So for example, plants have a fungus. Most plants have a fungus that lives in their root system that absorbs nutrients for them. So the plant provides food for the fungus, and the fungus absorbs inorganic nutrients that the plant is unable to take up on its own. In predation, one species benefits while the other species not so much because it's getting eaten. So in this example, the crocodiles are eating the fish. Crocodiles are benefited, the fish are harmed. In herbivory, an animal is consuming a plant or algae in an aquatic environment. So this is, for example, caterpillars eating leaves. So in herbivory, the animal that's eating the plant is benefited while the plant is harmed. And in parasitism, so when a parasite or pathogen is living in an organism or on an organism, the host is the organism. So in these examples, the host are the dogs and the humans, and the parasites being the worms and the bacteria. In a parasitic interaction, the parasite is benefited, but it's doing harm to the host organism. Okay, so going back to that first interaction called competition. Competition occurs when resources are shared and limited in some way. So we refer to this how an organism uses its resources in the environment as its ecological niche. So what kind of interaction it has with its environment. And when different organisms fill the same niche, interspecific competition occurs. So two populations are overlapping in a community and needing the same resource, making that resource become in short supply. So in general, competition reduces the carrying capacity of an ecosystem for those two competing populations, because those populations they're being stressed by two different populations, so that that resource could become limited, and one population may actually outcompete the other population for that resource. Okay, so as I mentioned, there is this mutualistic interaction where both partners are benefited through the interaction. I mentioned the mycorrhizae, the fungus that lives in the roots of vascular plants, that again, the plant makes the sugars that are supplied to the fungus, and the fungus absorbs minerals that the plant can't absorb, things like phosphorus that are available in the soil, but the plant can't take it up on its own. So this is a mutualistic relationship. Another example are reef-building corals and the photosynthetic microorganisms that live among them. So these are photosynthetic, they're called dinoflagellates. It's the kind of little microscopic organism that lives among the corals. And what happens is the dinoflagellates are given a nice, secure place where it's that they're protected, that they're not going to be eaten by herbivores, and it's in shallow enough water that they have ample access to light to do their photosynthesis. And the corals are benefited because they are the dinoflagellates are producing sugars through photosynthesis that provides energy to the corals. Okay, so predation. I think we all know what this is, when one species eats another. We've talked about the crocodiles eating fish. Predation is a benefit to the predator, but it kills the prey. So it's not only one of the species is benefiting from this interaction. But there are adaptations that preyed upon species have developed over time in order to defend against this predation. Things like camouflage. So, like the leaf bug that looks like a leaf. If a predator only eats insects, it's going to be less likely to be able to see that bug is an animal and not a leaf. They also have some mechanical defenses, things like a stinger on a bee. And then they also have some chemical defenses, things that may make them not taste very good. So if a predator eats a butterfly that has a chemical defense that makes it not taste very good, it's not going to be likely to eat another one of those butterflies. Okay, in herbivory, this is the interaction where an animal is eating a plant. Most of the time, herbivory is not fatal to the plant, but it does cause the plant to have to expend a lot of energy to replace the part of it that's lost. So plants have also evolved to have built-in defenses against herbivores. Things like spines and thorns are physical defenses. And then going back to the beginning of our talk here, a lot of plants have these chemical toxins, things that make them, again, either not taste good so that the herbivore will not want to eat them again, or may actually be toxic to the animal so that they physically cannot eat that plant. And these toxins are often the things that scientists are able to collect and manipulate to use in medicines or for other kinds of studies and purposes. So again, like the defenses that I mentioned that animals can have, these toxins in plants tend to be distasteful, so the herbivores learn to avoid them. And again, some can even cause detrimental effects to the herbivore, like abnormal development in insects if they're eating this plant. But there are some herbivore-plant interactions that illustrate this idea of coevolution. So they actually have evolved together in a way that has that the two species have evolved together in a way that has a beneficial response for both of them. For example, there is a plant called Passiflora that produces toxic chemicals that protect its leaves from most insects, except for this caterpillar called the Heliaconius, which has these enzymes in its digestive tract that are able to break down that toxic chemical. So as a result, the caterpillar has a food source that is not being competed over by any other insects. And the leaves, and also another adaptation is that the leaves of the plants have some yellow spots that look like Heliaconus eggs. It look like the eggs of that caterpillar. So other species avoid laying their eggs on the leaves that they think already have eggs. So that means that not a lot of caterpillars will hatch on these plants, and it limits the amount of herbivory by the caterpillar that's taking place on the plant. I hope I explained that well. Okay, and so as I mentioned, parasites, these are parasites and pathogens, things that can live in or on a host, and it obtains its nourishment from that host, and it does some kind of harm to the host. So we can have a couple different types. There can be internal parasites, things like tapeworms and nematodes that actually live in the guts of their in the guts or other organs of the host. I mentioned heartworm in dogs that actually lives in the heart muscle of the dog and does detrimental effect to that organism and to that organ. And then there can be external parasites, things like mosquitoes and ticks and aphids on plants. So plants can actually have parasites as well, things that will actually tap into the phloem of the plant, the sap of the plant, and live off of it and deplete the plant of the nutrients that it needs to pass through its tissues. So these pathogens can be, they can include bacteria and viruses and fungi and protists, which are microscopic organisms that can, things like amoeba, that cause amoebic dysentery. You've probably heard about. It's a GI, a gastrointestinal disease that you get from being exposed to these little protists. And sometimes pathogens can be introduced to a community where they're not necessarily, they're not naturally occurring. This is usually some kind of introduction by human activity. So we've had examples of the American chestnut, which has almost completely been wiped out by a protist that was brought over from Europe. And we're also experiencing on the West Coast sudden oak death, which is also caused by a pathogen. It's a fungus-like pathogen that's causing a lot of death in oak trees on the West Coast. Okay, so moving on to a different type of community dynamic, what we refer to as the trophic structure. So you've probably heard about food chains and food webs, and that's essentially what we're talking about here. This is how feeding relationships occur throughout different levels of the community. So we talk about the food chain sort of moving, that there's a base of a food chain, and that more complex organisms feed at different levels within this food chain. And what this allows is it allows chemical nutrients and other and organic matter to move up from the producers through different trophic levels. Trophic meaning food. That's all that means. Different food levels in a community. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are different levels, and they're pretty easy to remember because we just kind of put a number on them. So producers are the base of the food chain or the food web in all ecosystems. So those producers, again, going back to Bio 101, those are autotrophs. Auto meaning self, troph meaning food or feeding, so they make their own food. And they're the basic level that supports all other living organisms throughout the ecosystem. And then consumers are heterotrophs. So hetero meaning not auto, they don't make their own food. So herbivores, things that feed on vegetarians, essentially herbivores, are the primary consumers. So they're the first level, they eat the producers. Things that eat herbivores we refer to as the secondary consumers. Things that eat secondary consumers we call tertiary consumers. And up the chain, things that eat tertiary consumers, and I'll show you some graphics of this, are called the quaternary consumers. So the fourth level. But there are other types of organisms that are sort of outside of that primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure. There are things that kind of break down the material, not kind of break down, they do break down the organic matter in a community. These are things called detritivores and decomposers. So detritivores eat dead material that are produced at all the trophic levels. So all of the material that throughout all of those previous food levels that I talked about, detritivores break down and eat that dead material. And then decomposers are mainly prokaryotes, so single-celled organisms like bacteria and fungi. And these are things that can secrete enzymes, and they can secrete chemicals that actually digest molecules in inorganic material and convert them to organic. They convert organic matter into inorganic matter in a method called decomposition. So usually that in a terrestrial environment, those inorganic materials are then returned to the soil for producers then to be able to use in their photosynthetic activities. Okay, and here we have just sort of an image showing these different levels of consumption, the different levels of the food chain in both a terrestrial environment. So on land, we'll have a vascular plant, something like a grasshopper or some other kind of insect will eat the plant, making that the primary consumer. The mouse feeding on the primary consumer is a secondary consumer. The snake, who eats a secondary consumer, is a tertiary consumer. And the hawk that eats the snake is a quaternary consumer. And likewise, the base of the food web, the photosynthetic phytoplankton are the base of the food web in an aquatic food chain. Then the primary consumers, are referred to as zooplankton. So those are the more animal-like organisms that eat the phytoplankton. Small fish like herring feed on zooplankton. Larger fish like tuna will feed on the herring, and killer whales eat big fish like tuna. However, it's not really that straightforward. I mentioned food web. So we talk about food chains. It's more like a food web, what's going on, because different consumers might eat different types of things. They might, for example, we eat plants. So does that mean that we're primary consumers? But we might eat, a steak on our salad. So where does that put us? We're kind of in this web of this trophic organization. So a food web with more interactions is a more realistic way to approach understanding these trophic interactions. So for example, this is again a more realistic view of the trophic structure in a community. So this is the base. These are the producers that provide chemical energy and nutrients that are used by all the other members of the food web. And then here, these green lines, these are showing how the nutrient transfer from these producers. So again, there are the producers. We've got the mesquite and the brittlebush and prickly pear and saguaro cactus. And those producers are transferring nutrients to the primary consumers. So things like the grasshopper mouse, ants, other insects. These green lines are showing that from producer to primary consumer transfer of nutrients and energy. Yep, there we go. These blue lines, as you can see, these blue lines are indicating the transfer of nutrients from primary consumers to secondary consumers. And as you can see, in this case, when the mouse is eating the plant itself, it's a primary consumer, but in some cases it may be eating the primary consumer, the grasshopper, which would make it a secondary consumer. So some organisms can be put into multiple trophic levels or trophic categories. And then likewise, these purple lines, the darker purple lines, indicate the nutrient transfer from secondary to tertiary consumers, and from the lighter pink line is tertiary to quaternary consumers. So again, we can see that this red-tailed hawk, he's considered both secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumer because he can eat at multiple levels of the food chain. Okay, so what do these different levels of dynamics within within a community give us? This is what leads to what we call species diversity. And species diversity is not only how many different kinds of species there are, but how abundant each of those species are within a community. So there are two components to species diversity. The first being how many species, we call it species richness, and that's just simply how many different species are there in a community. And then relative abundance is the second part of species diversity. How many of each species is in that community? So for example, if you go into the woods, there may be a tree lot, a part of the woods that has 4 different species. But most of the species are one species, and there's only 1 or 2 of each of the other 3. But you might go to another section of the woods where it also has 4 species, but there's about the same number of each of the different types of species. So in that example, the species richness, the number 4 species, is the same for both, but the relative abundance is greater for the community that has more of each species within that community. And when we talk about low species diversity, that's typically not a positive thing for an ecosystem, but we've really that's really become quite characteristic of a lot of our modern ecosystems because of the way we depend on agriculture for our food sources. So for example, modern agricultural ecosystems, crops and things are planted in what we refer to as a monoculture. So mono just meaning one. It's a single species grown over a wide area, and what can happen here is one of the reasons in a natural environment, species diversity is important, is that there may be some kind of predator or other type of pathogen that affects one species, and if that's the only species that's there, that the whole ecosystem is turned upside down. So this is what happened around 1845. You might have heard of the Great Potato Famine in Ireland. It was a pathogen that wiped out a monoculture of potatoes in Ireland, and over 1 million people died of starvation, and another million had to leave Ireland in order to find food. So this was an example of an agricultural monoculture that devastated a human population. So, as you probably know, there are a lot of different things that can have an impact on the dynamics of communities. So, as I mentioned, the pathogen that wiped out the potatoes in Ireland, these are referred to as disturbances. So there are events like a pathogen invasion, or physical things like storms and fires and floods, that can cause damage to the biological communities. And more often, we're seeing human activity being a big cause of these disturbances. Small scales, sometimes these are really big, like a major earthquake, but the severity can vary from community to community, and between populations within the communities, a disturbance may have a different level of effect on different species. And there are small-scale disturbances that can even have positive impacts and positive effects on a community. But if there is a severe disturbance that strips away vegetation and removes a lot of the soil, it can really have a very long-lasting and prominent effect on how the ecosystem can recover. And as an ecosystem is recovering from these kinds of devastating events, we have these processes that we refer to as ecological succession. So it's how species transition to make up a community. So there will be what we refer to as primary succession, which is sort of the first organisms that move into a community. So like the gradual colonization of barren rocks where no other living life is. That would be primary succession. And then secondary succession is what occurs after the disturbance has destroyed a community, but there is soil intact. So this is an example. This is a picture here of the same spot. This is, oops, I'm sorry guys. This is an example of secondary succession. So this is Yellowstone National Park. After a fire wiped everything out, but it left those soils intact, so things could move back in. So the top picture was taken in November of 1988, and the bottom picture was taken in July of 1989, so not even a year in between these two pictures, and you can see how certain organisms are able to move in at different paces as the ecosystem becomes reestablished. Okay, so there are also different species that can integrate into a community and become really devastating. And we refer to these as invasive species. And they're organisms that have been introduced into non-native habitats. So being introduced into a habitat where they would not have naturally occurred. Typically this happens by human actions. We bringing trade in from other countries and things like that, not knowing that it's harmful, but because these things don't have natural enemies in the new environment, their population is able to explode, and often they outcompete. Going back to that competition interaction, they're able to outcompete the native species that live in that environment. Sorry again for the slow slides here. It's my recording has a lag. Okay, so that's the first big chunk of this chapter. The second being ecosystem structure and dynamics. And I'm going to pause here because I have thrown a lot of information at you. And we're going to break this chapter into 2 talks, and we'll pick up here in part 2.